So let's get right into the topic, which is sexual harassment and gender discrimination. A small note to the organizers, and it's not that I sort of. I want to start off by pointing out is that sexual harassment is a form of gender discrimination. And this is something which, if you have read the Supreme Court judgment in Vishaka and the earlier Export Promotion Council cases, you will know that this is a link that the Supreme Court explicitly draws. And it draws that link explicitly, keeping in mind the mandate of Article 14. It keeps in mind the requirement to make measures to protect women and children in the Constitution. But I think very broadly at a theoretical and philosophical position, we need to understand that sexual harassment is gender discrimination. It is a way to keep women out of the workforce. It essentially prevents them from taking part in paid employment, and it targets them because of their gender. So that is what I sort of want to talk about in the context of this talk. I'm sure you've heard quite a bit from different speakers, but I sort of want to focus this session a little bit on legal changes, on organizational policies, and something which perhaps we as lawyers don't really talk about or discuss that much, which is culture. And by culture, I don't mean the context of curves or the stuff that you see in movies and theatre, but organizational culture, which is a thing which, speaking for myself as a co-founder of the Vidhi Center for Legal Policy, I've had to learn the hard way. So let's get into the meat of the talk. And I'm not sure if you've already covered this, but sexual harassment is not necessarily a modern phenomenon. We tend to think that women's participation in the formal workforce is a modern thing, but actually women have been working in places outside their home for many centuries, millennia even. And we have two instances from mythology and from scriptures which sort of tells us that this is a phenomenon which happened much prior to modern day. Anybody want? I've put two images here, and I'll tell you all later what that is. But anybody want to take a guess? What are the two instances that are shown in these two images? Sorry?
They have been queens.
But names. I'm looking for names. There are 4 names. Okay, there are 3 names and 1 description. There are 4 people in these 2 images. Anybody can name the people in the images or the event at least? Sorry? No. I mean, in the broad right area, yes. I mean, geographically. The latter, the below one refers to something in the Bible, and the top one refers to something in the Mahabharata. Let's see if that's made easier. And? No.
Pontius Pilate.
Sorry?
Pontius Pilate.
Who? No. No? Okay. Anybody want to take? Draupadi is one of them, but that's not the instance that I'm talking about. Remember, I'm talking about sexual harassment at the workplace. Think back to your Mahabharata. Somebody, I heard the beginnings of the answer.
The king when they were in hiding.
Name. Kichaka, yes, that's the right answer. So the first example that we see is Kichaka and Draupadi. The second example is Joseph and Potiphar's wife. Actually, a little bit more, and this is to help me make the point. The story of Kichaka, and some of you will know this, the Pandavas and Draupadi were supposed to spend the final year of their exile in hiding. No one was supposed to know who they were. So they took on fake names, they took on fake identities, and went to work in another kingdom. Right? Now, in that kingdom, Draupadi took on the role of a chambermaid to the queen, and other Pandavas took on different kinds of roles. Now, Draupadi's caught the attention of the queen's brother, Kichaka, and he kept persisting, he kept pestering her, said, no, I want to marry you, I really want to marry you, you have to marry me. And the fact that he was the queen's brother meant that the pressure on Draupadi was terrible. So she kind of, because she knew the other Pandavas were there, she complained to Bhima, who enacted this elaborate ruse and enticed Kichaka into a room and basically beat him into such pulp that people couldn't recognize which body parts go where. So, not that that is the necessary remedy, but that was an instance of someone at her workplace kind of being harassed while doing her duty by someone who is sort of her superior in some context. The next example comes from the Bible, specifically comes from the book of Genesis. Now Joseph has been sold by his brothers to the to the Egyptians and is working as a slave in the palace of Potiphar, who's somebody important in Egypt. And as a slave, again, he catches the attention of Potiphar's wife, who makes a sexual move on him. Joseph refuses because he knows he'll be in enormous trouble if he says yes, but he's also in enormous trouble if he says no. So he avoids her advances, but she then goes and complains against him, saying Joseph made the advances against me to the officials, and Joseph is thrown in prison for a lot of time. In both of these stories, what I want you to take away are the common facets that makes them sexual harassment. Number one is somebody at their workplace, all right? Whether you're a slave, and this is the point that I sort of want to make, that sure, Joseph may not have any legal rights as we understand them, but he was working there. So was Draupadi. They were harassed against their wishes by someone in a position of power. This is something that a lot of people don't really understand about sexual harassment, right? There is a broader pop culture, I think, loose use of the term sexual harassment, where we forget a very important element to it, which is the power dynamic. And this power dynamic is what lies at the heart of both of these examples, and this is why I've picked them up to show that this is not something recent which happened with women entering the workforce en masse. It is something that has been with human society as long as we've had patriarchy, as long as we've had unequal power relations in a workplace or between men and women. We have had this. So please keep that in mind, that when we are talking about sexual harassment, even if the focus is on women in the workplace, right, even if you make it gender neutral, the underlying idea is about someone exploiting a power dynamic in some way to harass you and prevent you from doing your work, to making the workplace a hostile environment, right? So if you were to put yourself in the shoes of Draupadi or Joseph, the slave, you will find that day-to-day existence in the workplace becomes a nightmare. You're constantly on edge, you're anxious, you don't know who will come up when and ask you to do something you don't want to do. And that makes for a hostile work environment. So keeping this in mind is very important when we talk about sexual harassment as a concept. So moving on, this is something which I just mentioned, and I'm putting down the text for you. It goes beyond individual incidents. There is a tendency to see sexual harassment as a series of incidents, or this person did that, or that person did this. But usually that is the result of a certain work atmosphere, a certain work climate, and a certain pattern. Alright? Because we are not talking about, say, street harassment, where somebody says something to you while you're passing by them, you never see that person, but it makes you feel bad in a certain way. This is a different kind of exercise, because this is somebody just somewhere where you have to go to on a daily basis and meet the same person in the same context, and they are making that space uncomfortable for you, right? So to that extent, this is about making a work environment somewhere that is hostile, something that is not enjoyable for the person who's there. So I'm sure you've already dealt with the legal framework. I don't want to go into it in detail, but I wanted to take away 3 things about the sexual harassment law as it stands in India. Number 1, it focuses on punitive measures. What happens if someone is a victim of sexual harassment, right? You have the internal process and you have the external process. The internal process is what happens within the company. The external process is what happens outside the company when the victim does not get relief within the company. But most of these measures are about punishing the perpetrator finding out who was the perpetrator, what they did, what is the appropriate punishment, who will be the person who's authorized to take action. So this is really one big focus of the Act. Another lesser focus of the Act, but it's still the focus of the Act, is restorative justice. Can we make the victim whole in some way? Right? Can the company or the perpetrator provide some sort of compensation or some sort of damages which will make the victim whole? Right? That is provided for, it is within the structure of the Act. But what I want to focus on in today's discussion and what I want to spend most of my time talking about is what is not in the Act, which is a preventative mechanism. Now, when we are talking about sexual harassment, it is one thing to say, let us try and figure out how to deal with it after it happens. But it is a much more difficult task and a much more complicated task to try and understand what needs to be done to prevent it in the first place. Now, it is possible, it is not easy, and perhaps, and this is what I want you all to think about, maybe the law is not the right answer for this. That the answers may lie elsewhere in not what we call law and not what we understand as the law. This comes a little bit from the last 10, 11 years or so, being a co-founder of Vidhi, being part of the management at Vidhi, having to grapple with some of the questions as we saw Vidhi, which grew from an organization of 4 or 5 people to now today it's about 90 to 100 people. And the kinds of challenges that we face, the kinds of growth that the organization saw, all of this gave an understanding of what it takes perhaps to make an organization where about 75% of the people who work for Vidhi are women. And this one way to answer this point is to say that it's completely accidental, because we as lawyers are in a profession where women are almost actively driven out of litigation practice, and they have 3 avenues outside. Because when you graduate, and I can already see from the composition of this audience, it's a 50-50 gender breakup, if not more favoring women. But if you go to the courtrooms, you will find that practicing lawyers, it's vastly more men than women. And this is also borne out from our data, which we collected back in 2018. You're all welcome to check out that data. It's on the Supreme Court website, where we surveyed 8 high courts across the country. One of the things which we did was also look at the gender breakup. And the most gender equal was Kerala High Court, where about 27% of the practicing advocates were women. Alright? Give or take 3 or 4%, that has changed since 2018. Add a couple of percentage points for error margins. You still don't have more than a third of practicing lawyers in the most gender equal court being women. And the numbers are much, much shockingly lower for other high courts, especially in North and East India. So, women who don't find an avenue for practice, and I don't want to get into that in too much detail, end up going to law firms. There's a fantastic book by a Nalsar senior of mine called Shweta Balakrishnan. She's written this book on how law firms have been able to attract a lot of women, how they have been promoted and how they run a lot of law firms. Please do look this book up. If I remember correctly, it's called Accidental Feminists. A lot of women do take up judicial exams, which I'm sure a lot of you are interested in, a lot of you are looking to prepare for going forward. And it is one of the few avenues where there is genuinely equal opportunity. And of course there are challenges at the workplace, but it is an opportunity for a lot of women. And the third option happens to be organizations like us, NGOs, companies and so on, where we kind of offer this stability in workplace, a steady ladder for career growth and reasonable working hours, which helps women in a lot of ways to work at Vidhi. But that aside, let's not generalize what is possible in the legal profession to other professions, other organizations, other occupations across the country. All right. So, to come back to the earlier point, can the law prevent sexual harassment? And my answer is probably not. The law may go some way, but it's very unlikely to have any major significant impact on sexual harassment that might take place. And the reason is, law can only provide a set of norms. It needs to be enforced. You cannot enforce it, you can't have an inspector sitting in every single workplace. You cannot impose such heavy rules that make enforcement of the rules non-practical or too costly. And there are also risks of such rules becoming counterproductive. That it may actually result in workplaces saying, you know what, we don't want to deal with this regulation, let's just hire fewer women. And we've seen some element of this happen in the context of the Maternity Benefits Act, which did not really think through how it would fund maternity benefits for women. As a result, a lot of companies have stopped hiring women, saying that the cost is too much and nobody's reimbursing this cost. So yes, it's very well that you want to impose this obligation on private entities to provide maternity benefit, but I cannot. I do not have the resources to do so. So to ensure that something counterproductive like that does not happen in the context of sexual harassment, perhaps we need to think more in the context of cultural and organizational change, right? Now, of course, the right person to speak about this in much more detail may be somebody who has studied HR in depth, maybe somebody who has studied organizational psychology and organizations in depth. But I want to introduce a few ideas here for you as lawyers and some of you who are not lawyers to also think about in the context of how to prevent sexual harassment. And I wanted to sort of think a little bit more and in depth about law may not necessarily be the state wielding a big stick. It may be something more about setting down certain norms and processes that need to be followed within an organization. But why should an organization do this, right? A lot of times, when we speak to lawyers, people tend to think that if the state is not wielding a big stick and making you do something, no one will do any such thing. So, again, summarizing a lot of literature that is out there that you can go and look up and read. What is the organizational case for undertaking measures to prevent sexual harassment? Well, number one, the very obvious one is your talent pool increases. People will feel more compelled to work in your organization. Women will feel that this is an organization I want to work with, that I want to apply, and when your pool of candidates increases, you're able to get much better candidates of any gender. So, in one sense, it allows you to attract top talent. Number two, it's not enough to attract top talent, you need to be able to retain them. When people feel that they are in a healthy work atmosphere that respects them, that treats them with dignity, that gives them a certain kind of respect for the work that they do, they will stay longer, right? People tend to think that, it's just money. If you offer more money, you can essentially entice anyone out of any job, but that's not true. It's true in certain instances, but for a lot of people are willing to take a job cut if it means that the hidden costs of a toxic workplace they don't have to bear. So, in that sense, it allows organizations to retain talent. And third, it improves the efficiency and effectiveness of the organization. Now, note, I have not said all for-profit organizations should think about it. I say all organizations, whether you're an NGO, whether you're an university, whether you're a school, whether you're a government, or whether you're a top company, you're all set up for a particular purpose, right? Any organization, if Vidhi is set up for a not-for-profit, as a not-for-profit, for the purposes of legal research and assisting the government in making better laws, we want to be able to do that. Because at the end of the day, we are measured not on how well we speak at events or otherwise, but whether we're actually doing that. And when our employees are motivated to do this, that is when we as Vidhi succeed as an organization. And that's as true for a small company like ours, a not-for-profit like ours, as it is true for the largest corporations and governments around the world. Having a work environment where everyone's welcome, where everyone feels welcome, where talent is respected, and you have a friendly, respectful, dignified work atmosphere attracts more talent. If I have to make this more specific, a few years ago I was invited to judge a competition which assessed how well companies, small and large, across the country had implemented norms to protect against sexual harassment. And I was surprised to find that some of the top ranking big companies, not the small ones, big companies were all textile companies. I was like, this is very interesting. And this is across the country. What is prompting textile companies to do so well when it comes to sexual harassment? Number one, 80 to 90% of their workforce were women. And that's a conservative estimate, it's probably much higher. Because women are now the backbone of India's textile industry. You may not remember, but about a decade ago, there was a sudden outbreak of civil unrest in Bangalore, which was driven by women-led unions of textile workers across Bangalore who worried about their public provident fund withdrawals. And that was when people realized, wow, there are like lakhs and lakhs of women working in the textile sector in Bangalore. And this particular workforce is not easy to replace, needs to be trained, and a lot of the textiles that are manufactured in India are exported abroad. Now, the easy answer would be to say, well, of course, there's pressure from the buyers to make sure that sexual harassment norms are put in place and processes are put in place, so that's why they're putting it in place. But there's an additional reason, because as much as we think that making textiles is just a mechanical job, it's not. It requires a high level of precision, it requires a high level of focus, it requires a high level of concentration, or else what will turn out will not be acceptable to the eventual buyer. So you want your workforce to be absolutely focused. You want them in that common area to be focusing only on this and not what the supervisors generally tend to be male, which is also the source of a lot of sexual harassment. You would have read accounts of this. You want to be focused on your work and not what someone else is doing. So therefore, you create that atmosphere which brings out the best in your workers. You make sure that the textiles that are coming out from your factory are the highest possible quality, and that's possible when your workers are focused exclusively on producing that product rather than their own health and safety within the workplace. So this is just one example, and why organizations need to think about putting in place mechanisms for preventing sexual harassment. So what could this mechanism be? So let's start with one basic idea that not all organizations are exactly alike. You can't say that a startup is the same as the Tata Sons or the Indian Railways or the government of India. The key difference is not just numbers, but it's complexity. All right? When an organization has more employees, there are more functions being carried out, and as a result of this, there is increased complexity in the kind of work that the organization does, to what extent, how it should be done, and so on. And rules are necessary to be able to deal with the complexity. But the opposite is also true, right? You need not have extremely complex rules which actively impede the functioning of an organization when you're not that big, when you're not that complex. So if I have to plot it on a spectrum where you have a startup or a small organization at one end and you have a large government or a bureaucracy at the other end, the further you get along this spectrum, the more you will need written down rules. But equally, when you go down the spectrum on this side, you will need more discretion and guidance, right? If it is 6 friends who know each other, who kind of come from the same background, who are doing the same kind of work, you'll all know what needs to be done, what does not need to be done. You don't need to put elaborate rules. But when it expands to 12 people, when it has 6 people who have no idea who you are or what you do, you perhaps need a little bit more by way of rules. You perhaps need a little bit more by way of processes. When it expands to say 24 people, completely different sets of people, completely different kinds of structure that is needed, you will need to put in more rules. So think about it in that way, that as an organization gets bigger, more and more of its work will have to be guided by written down rules. And these written down rules are not just about copying pasting something and calling it policy. Each sexual harassment policy for a company needs to be tailored to that industry. It needs to understand what is the kind of work that is taking place in this organization that this organization exists for, and how this particular policy will need to work for it. To give you one example, you may say that a lot of NGOs probably need the same kind of policy. But wildlife NGOs, for instance, where a lot of the work happens in the field, right, where you're going and staying for weeks in the forest or in some remote area, that is equally a workplace as much as the main office where the work of the organization is taking place. So, in that sense, any sexual harassment policy needs to take into account that you will need to tailor it, you need to put in place something which will address situations where you are on the field. And that includes making things like having a separate area for the men, separate area for the women, providing adequate washing facilities, making sure that the women have a safe access to and back from that area. All of these things are something that needs to be thought about and put in place, without just assuming that it's just a compliance thing, put in place a policy and everything will be fine. But that's not enough. Even if you tailor a policy and you say this is the best possible way to do it, what actually prevents perhaps sexual harassment is not just saying do's and don'ts. It's about setting and putting in place certain processes and procedures which make sure that at every point of time, interactions involving people in the company, whether inside or outside, happen in a way that ensures this kind of respect or dignity of the employee. Keep in mind that a lot of employees will be going outside the company as well. And scope of the law covers that, but that is punitive, right? Like we said, that is punitive. All elements relating to prevention must also include things like trips outside the office, trips beyond the office, and so on. Finally, the organization must clarify the expectations in all contexts. You're not just to worry about how you treat your fellow employees only when you're inside the office, but also when you have traveled outside for work to a different context. Lastly, I'll come to the most difficult aspect of the matter. And this is something which I learned the complexity and the difficulty of it only when I was actually, along with my colleagues, in charge of running an organization. And that is the element of culture. Culture is what really drives an organization forward. And it's this organizational culture which is the hardest to build and the hardest to foster. It's also the easiest to destroy, right? And it's always top down. In an organization with some level of hierarchy, the culture of the organization is going to be determined by the behavior of the people at the top. And this is not something that you can use a stick to beat something into someone at some point. It is something where you have to believe that this is the organization that we want, this is how we want it to be, and this is how we will conduct ourselves to ensure that our organization not only works in this way, not only perceived in a certain way, but works in a certain context. All right? And what does building this culture look like? Right? It involves the combination of the right values, rules, and practices. So, without any of these, you just can't build a culture of it. Right? You have to have an organization which not just says these are our values, right? Everybody puts up posters saying these are our values. That's not enough. You need to sort of put in place the mechanisms, the policies, the procedures which actually reflect these values. And this is, of course, easier said than done. This is something which a lot of organizations try and fail to do, but that doesn't mean they should stop trying, because getting it right is a huge, huge bonus for the organization. Lastly, I sort of end on this point that any culture which, sort of is set must at least involve these three non-exhaustive values, which is the element of respect for the individual, respect for dignity. It has to involve an element of open communication. You need to create an organizational culture where people feel confident that when they complain, they are heard. May not be that the action will be absolutely perfect, that you'll address every single concern, but they should feel that, and this just doesn't relate to when an actual instance of sexual harassment takes place. It starts from the small things. If someone is complaining about the smell in the toilets, are they being heard? Is it being acted upon? Or do they have to worry, who will I complain to when they make my life miserable afterwards? right? You cannot have an organization which says we will absolutely treat every this complaint related to sexual harassment without fear or favor, but don't complain about anything else because we'll come chasing after you and we'll blame you for having raised the complaint as opposed to acting on it. So this kind of open communication within the organization is an important aspect, and it is not something which is often talked about. You will not magically start to get complaints about sexual harassment just because you have put in place the policy, just because you have ticked that box, just because you have created a committee. You need to have a culture which promotes this kind of open communication. Finally, and this is something which I'm sort of probably preaching to the absolutely wrong crowd about this, especially college students, learning to be rules and process oriented. Because I was there, and the last thing I wanted to do when I was in college is to follow all the rules and follow all the processes and follow all the procedures. And even if I did, it was, because I had no other choice. But as you go along, you realize how much this protects. Not just in a way of, of deviating responsibility, but of making sure that things are done in the right way and in the right context. And since I started with the mythological reference, I'll end with the mythological reference, which comes from the story of from the Mahabharata, which is the story of the Yaksha. The 5 Pandavas are lost in the forest. They are extremely thirsty, and they go out to look for water. But Yudhishthira, who's the eldest, sends out the youngest first, but he doesn't come back for an hour. They're still very thirsty. Sends out the second youngest, then he sends out Arjuna, then he sends out Bhima. Finally, he goes to the pond himself and wonders what has happened. He just finds his brothers laying dead. There, a voice tells him, your brothers failed to answer these questions and therefore they're lying dead. You who claim to be the seeker of dharma and the truth, you answer these questions. If they're right, we'll see. So Yudhishthira answers these questions, and of course he gets all of them correct. Correct in the sense of answering to the satisfaction of this voice from the jungle. And the voice says, finally, all right, you've done an extremely good job. You've answered all the questions. I have one final question for you. Which of your, if I will revive one of your brothers, but you can only choose one. Which one? So Yudhishthira, without hesitation, says, I will choose Sahadeva, who is his youngest brother. The voice is shocked. The voice is like, Arjuna, your brother is the greatest archer in the world. Bhima, your other brother, is the strongest man in the world. Why didn't you choose any of them? Why did you go after your youngest brother, who has his merits, but let's be honest, he's not Arjuna or Bhima. So Yudhishthira says something which in Sanskrit you would have probably seen in a lot of places. He says that when a man is faced with troubles, it's not Arjuna or Bhima who protects him, but it is dharma which protects him. And the dharma is the obedience to the laws, the rules, to certain codes of conduct, norms, behavior. That is what protects him. He says, my father had 2 wives, right? From the eldest wife, there were 3 of us. From the second wife, there were the twins Nakula and Sahadeva. I as Yudhishthira am alive. That is, at least my mother still has one son. But neither of the sons of Madri are alive. So I'm saying at least one, so that there is justice in this process. That both of my father's wives should have at least one son alive. That is why I'm asking for Sahadeva. This of course impresses the Yaksha, whose voice it is, and he gives all of them life. But the larger point is this, that following rules and procedures isn't about avoiding responsibility, isn't about protecting yourself if things go wrong. It's about ensuring that you do the right thing when required, and you've done it at the right time. Right? So with that, I'll close. Thank you so much. And I think we have some time for questions and answers. Yeah.
Someone like you who has worked in Supreme Court, what are the number of cases, or let's say the percentage of cases that falls against men and against women?
In what context?
In sexual harassment.
So, just understand where the Supreme Court sits, right? So, if 100 cases are filed in district court, one of them is appealed to the High Court. If 100 cases are appealed to the Supreme Court, to the High Court, one such case goes to the Supreme Court. So you're talking about a fractionally small number of cases. It is very few. It is very difficult to draw any conclusions. More than that, a better measure may be high courts. The Supreme Court requires a lot of resources to go up. A lot of people give up at the High Court stage, don't end up going to the Supreme Court. So whatever answer I give you will not make any sense. This is where unfortunately not enough people have done research, and instead of giving an offhand answer about 50-50 or 60-40 or 70-30, I'd invite the student body of CMR University to do this research. Pick up all the judgments of all the high courts are now freely, openly available. Indian Kanun run by my friend Sushant Sinha, I'm sure all of you used it. Look it up. Pull out the case data, look at all the cases related to the Prevention of Sexual Harassment Act. See how many of them go in favor of women, how many of them go in favor of the men. In a completely different context, this research was published recently by another scholar that I know, Beena Agarwal. She looked at the claims of men and women, or claims of women in the context of Hindu succession, right, where women have a right to claim property equally. And she found that the pattern was very uneven across the country. Where women have more access to education, more resources, they are more successful in their case at the High Court level. In fact, filing the case itself is a challenge for them. But even then, they do face some success. But it's much harder in different parts of the country. So in that sense, please do look up Beena's research, Beena Agarwal's research. You'll find it online about specifically the Succession Act. But I'm pretty sure you'll find a similar pattern in the context of the high courts as well. You will find that overall, very few cases are filed. Most of those will be filed by men. So women will be filing some cases, but a majority will be going in favor of them. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you all. I hope you found this talk useful.